The wind sweeping through Solitude Creek in the autumn of 1888 was a restless spirit, carrying the scent of pine and the whisper of a coming winter. It spoke of endings and harsh truths. Clara Vance, at 40, stood on the porch of the dilapidated ranch house that was now hers. Her hands, once celebrated for their grace on ivory keys, now raw from mending fences. She watched a young ranch hand, Leo Thorne, calm a spooked mare, his movements a quiet language of muscle and instinct. She had buried a life in New York, a marriage of quiet disappointments, and had sworn herself to the solitude this land promised. But Leo, barely 23, with eyes that held the deep stillness of the mountains and a past he never spoke of, made her feel the stirrings of a melody she thought long forgotten. The way his gaze would sometimes find hers across the windswept yard. A look of frank curiosity, unburdened by judgment, sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the Wyoming sun. A chasm of 17 years lay between them, yet the unspoken connection that hummed in the space they shared felt more real than anything she had known. When their eyes met, she felt a dangerous, forgotten chord resonate within her, a note that warned of scandal, of ruin, and of a passion powerful enough to shatter the fragile peace she had sought. The nearest town was already murmuring. The land baron in the next valley was already circling. And hidden in the shadows of the past, secrets were stirring that would challenge whether their unlikely bond could ever survive in a land that was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. Clara Vance had journeyed to Wyoming to confront a ghost, her estranged father, only to find he'd left her nothing but his land and more questions. The Solitude Creek Ranch was a sprawling, untamed canvas under a sky of impossible blue, its sheer scale both a burden and a promise of freedom. She'd inherited it from a man whose face she could barely recall, a man who had nonetheless entrusted her with his legacy, perhaps sensing in her a core of resilience that her life of refined society had never tested. The first time she truly saw Leo Thorne, he was mending a harness in the fading light of the barn, his brow furrowed in concentration. Dust motes danced in the slanted rays of sun, illuminating the focused line of his jaw and the strength in his hands. At 23, his body was sculpted by relentless work, lean and powerful. But it was the quiet intensity of his face that held her. His gray eyes seemed to absorb everything and reveal little, hinting at a life that had taught him to watch and wait. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, finally noticing her presence in the doorway. It was respectful, yet held a note of something else, a deep current that made her pulse flutter. "Didn't hear you approach. I am Clara Vance, the new owner," she stated, extending a hand, consciously fighting the impulse to study the way the fading light caught in his dark, unruly hair. "Leo Thorne, ma'am. Your foreman, I suppose, if that's agreeable." His calloused hand enveloped hers, and even through her leather glove, she felt the startling warmth of his skin. "I'd understand if you wanted to hire your own man. Can you manage this place, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over the weathered barn, the untended fields, and then back to him, noting the faint scar that cut through his right eyebrow. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his jaw tightening slightly. "I can manage whatever needs managing." The simple words, spoken with unwavering certainty, settled something in her. She should have established a formal distance then, recognized the spark in the way he looked at her, not as a grieving daughter or a city madam, but as a woman. Instead, she heard herself say, "Then the position is yours." 3 weeks later, an early blizzard descended from the mountains with a silent, blinding fury. Clara had ridden out with Leo to track a missing calf, determined to learn the boundaries of her inheritance. The wall of white rolled over the plains without warning. Leo found her just as the world dissolved into a swirl of snow, his strong arm pulling her from her disoriented horse onto the back of his own. They pushed on, his body a solid shield against hers. His warm breath a startling presence against her ear as he shouted encouragement over the wind's shriek. They finally collapsed into a remote line shack, a primitive shelter against the storm's rage. The sudden silence inside was profound, broken only by the howl of the wind and the crackle of the fire Leo quickly built. Clara stood in the center of the small room, intensely aware of him, of the way melted snow made his shirt cling to his chest, of how the firelight carved shadows and planes across his face. Storms set in. "We'll be here till morning," he said, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes were not. They traced the line of her throat where her collar had fallen open, lingered on her hands now clasped before her. "Mr. Thorne," she began, intending it as a boundary, but the word came out on a shaky breath. "Ma'am." He moved closer, then closer still, until the heat from his body seemed to wrap around her. "Tell me to stop," she should have. Every bit of her former life, every rule of propriety screamed at her to step away. She was Clara Vance, a woman of breeding and restraint. He was Leo Thorne, a ranch hand young enough to be... She refused to finish the thought. Instead of speaking, she reached out and gently traced the scar above his eye with a single fingertip. He drew in a sharp breath, his hand coming up to cover hers, pressing her palm to his cheek. "Clara," he whispered, and her name on his lips was an unfamiliar, devastating sound. When he kissed her, it was with the desperate, soul-deep thirst of a man who had been wandering a desert. His lips were chapped and firm, demanding and yet tender, tasting of the cold air and a profound warmth that seemed to come from his very core. She answered with a lifetime of unspoken longing, her arms encircling his neck, her body fitting against his with an instinctive, shameless rightness. His hands, rough and sure, found the buttons of her coat, pushing the heavy fabric aside. She arched into his touch as his palm slid over the thin cotton of her blouse, branding her skin. When his mouth followed that path, trailing fire down her throat to the hollow of her collarbone, she gasped his name. They came together on a rough wool blanket before the fire, two solitary souls finding an impossible sanctuary in one another. He learned the forgotten rhythms of her body with an intuition that left her breathless, his youthful energy tempered by a reverence that made her feel cherished. When he moved over her, his gray eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't name, she saw not a boy, but the man who could answer her fire with his own. Afterward, they lay tangled together as the blizzard raged on, her head resting on his chest, his fingers gently tracing patterns in her hair. "This is madness," she whispered against his skin. "Maybe," he agreed, his voice a low vibration beneath her ear. "But it's the most sense anything has made in a long time." The next morning broke painfully bright, the world blanketed in a pristine, unforgiving white. With the light came the full weight of their actions. They rode back in a heavy silence, each stolen glance, each accidental brush of his hand against hers, charged with a new and dangerous significance. The few remaining ranch hands saw them ride in together, their knowing looks a judgment more cutting than any sermon. By evening, word had reached Silas Blackwood. He appeared on her porch as the sun set, a man whose presence seemed to suck the warmth from the air. He was a cattle baron, her neighbor, a man whose ambition was as vast as the land he coveted. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice a gravelly drawl that grated on her nerves. "I've heard some unsettling things about you and that Thorne boy." "My foreman is my concern, Mr. Blackwood," Clara said, her voice betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. "When it makes you a laughingstock and threatens the decency of this valley, it becomes my concern," he retorted, his eyes cold and hard. "Your father, God rest his soul, was a man of principle. He'd be turning in his grave. He and I had an understanding about this land, an agreement. I have seen no such agreement in his papers. Perhaps you haven't looked hard enough," he sneered. "A woman like you alone. You can't run this place, especially not while you're distracted. Sell it to me." "It's the only sensible option." Leo emerged from the house, his presence a silent, solid force at her back. "I believe the lady has made her position clear, Silas." Blackwood's face darkened. "You stay out of this, boy. This is business between landowners." He turned his venom back to Clara. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away clean. Don't make me get the law involved. Don't make me prove you're unfit." He left, but his threat hung in the frigid air. That night, Clara stood at her parlor window, watching Leo moving through the moonlit snow, and she wondered if, in finding a moment of warmth, she had just condemned them both to the cold. Silas Blackwood arrived a week later, not with threats, but with the town sheriff and a sheaf of papers. He looked like a vulture in a fine wool coat, his smile thin and predatory. "Clara, my dear," he said, the false familiarity setting her teeth on edge. "A little legal matter has come to light." "What is this, Silas?" she asked, stepping back as he entered her home. Her home, uninvited. "A prior claim," he announced with a flourish, handing the documents to the sheriff. "A lien against this property signed by your father. Seems he borrowed a substantial sum from me years ago with the ranch as collateral. A debt that is now due." Clara's blood ran cold. That's impossible. My father would never. Can you prove it? Blackwood's smile was triumphant. I have his signature. The territorial judge is an old friend of mine. He'll see this my way. Unless, of course, you're willing to be reasonable. He named a price for the ranch that was a fraction of its worth. Or, he added, his eyes glinting, you could simply dismiss the boy. Publicly. Prove you're a respectable woman, and perhaps I can be convinced to extend your terms of payment. That evening, as Clara paced the room like a trapped animal, Leo found her staring into the fire, the forged papers crumpled in her fist. He can take it all, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The ranch, my father's legacy, everything, unless I get rid of you, unless I play the part of the chaste widow he thinks I should be. Leo was silent for a long time, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was as solid as the mountains. Is that what you want, Clara? For me to leave? The question was a physical blow. Outside, the wind moaned, a lonely, desolate sound. What I want, she said, her voice breaking, and what I'm allowed to have are two very different things. Blackwood didn't wait for her decision. He wanted to break her. Mysterious fires started along her fence lines at night. Her best breeding bull was found dead near a poisoned stream. The few hands she had left were scared off by masked riders who delivered threats in the dead of night. It's Blackwood's brand of persuasion, Leo said grimly, examining the tracks near the stream. He's trying to bleed you out, make it impossible to continue. Clara loaded her father's old rifle, her hands surprisingly steady. Then he has underestimated me. Clara, this isn't your fight, Leo said, his hand covering hers on the rifle stock. Walk away. You'll be safe. You can start again. She looked at him. This quiet, resilient young man who had awoken her from a long slumber, and she made her choice. I am not running away, Leo, not from him and not from what this is. The attack came at dusk 3 days later. Clara was in the study, poring over her father's old ledgers, when the first gunshot shattered the window. Glass exploded inward. Leo's voice roared from the barn. Clara, get down! She grabbed the rifle and crawled to the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. In the fading light she saw them, 6 riders fanning out using the outbuildings for cover, their rifles spitting fire. Bullets thudded into the log walls of the house. Leo burst through the back door, a dark line of blood already seeping from a graze on his forearm. They're trying to pin us in, he said, reloading his own rifle with a calm efficiency that belied the danger. We hold the house. We hold, Clara agreed, her mouth dry. She chambered around, the solid click of the mechanism a small anchor in the chaos. They took up positions, trading shots with the shadows outside. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Leo's shooting was precise, aimed to disable, not kill. A bullet from his rifle struck a rider's shoulder, sending the man tumbling from his horse. Clara's shot kicked up dirt in front of another horse, making it rear and throw its rider, creating confusion. But they were outnumbered. A bullet tore through the wall near Leo's head, showering him with splinters. He cursed and fired back. Blackwood's out there, he muttered, watching his dogs do his dirty work. As if on cue, a voice boomed from the darkness near the porch. It was Silas, flanked by 2 of his men. Vance, this is over! Throw down your weapons. The ranch is mine, but I'll let you live. And if we don't? Leo yelled back. Blackwood's laugh was ugly. Then I'll burn this house to the ground with both of you in it. Self-defense, the sheriff will call it. A tragic accident. It was Clara who saw the opening. While Blackwood was gloating, she fired a single, calculated shot not at him, but at the lantern hanging on the porch. It exploded, plunging their side of the house into darkness and showering Blackwood's men with burning oil. One of the men screamed, his jacket catching fire. The root cellar, now! Leo yelled, providing covering fire as Clara scrambled toward the kitchen. He followed, slamming the heavy door shut just as bullets hammered the wood above them. In the cramped darkness, lit only by a sliver of moonlight from an air vent, he slumped against the wall. The graze on his arm was bleeding freely now, and a fresh stain was spreading across his ribs from where a ricocheting bullet had torn through his shirt. You're hurt, Clara breathed, tearing a strip from her petticoat to press against the worst of the wounds. Her hands were shaking. It's nothing, he lied, his teeth gritted in pain. He's lost men. He's angry now. He'll get desperate. Leo, she whispered in the dark, the air thick with the smell of earth and fear. If we don't... We will, he interrupted, his hand finding her face. He pulled her close, his kiss fierce and brief, tasting of gunpowder and desperation, a promise made in the heart of a battle. "We will." Above them, the gunfire stopped. Then slow, heavy footsteps on the kitchen floor. Blackwood's voice seething with rage. "You think this little cellar can save you? Come out, or I swear I will set this blaze myself." Clara chambered another round, her fear cooling into a hard, clear resolve. Leo struggled to his feet, rifle in hand. They climbed the ladder together, emerging into a house scarred and broken, but still standing. The yard was a chaotic scene of wounded men and panicked horses. Blackwood stood in the doorway, his face illuminated by the flickering flames from the porch, his pistol leveled unsteadily. The final showdown was swift and brutal. Leo fired from the top of the cellar steps, his shot hitting Blackwood's gun hand, sending the pistol flying. Clara was already moving, using the rifle not to shoot, but as a club, swinging the heavy stock and catching Blackwood across the knees. He fell with a howl of pain and rage. The fight was over. The remaining men fled into the night. Silas Blackwood lay defeated on the floor of the house he had tried to steal. Leo swayed, the loss of blood finally catching up to him. Clara was there, catching him, easing him down onto the floor. "It's over," she whispered, her hand pressed against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. We held. His eyes fluttered open, a faint smile touching his blood-streaked lips. "Told you we would." 6 months later, Clara Vance stood on the porch of her ranch house, a hammer in her hand. The scent of fresh-cut lumber filled the air. She was no longer the woman who had arrived in Wyoming, a stranger in a strange land. She was the woman who had fought for her home and won. Leo came to stand beside her, his arm, now fully healed, resting lightly on her shoulders. They watched the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across the land that was now indisputably theirs. The whispers in town had not ceased, but they no longer mattered. Here, in the vast, quiet solitude of Wyoming, they had built a world of their own,